Right. So yeah. Basically, I decided to. I've my research is based around the Living Well to Die Well course with the Mindfulness Association, and through copyright and other thing, I've changed the title to suit really. It's Living Abundantly While Dying, and Managing End of Life Anxiety. Would you move on, Jane, please? Thank you. So basically, into my introduction, I looked at sort of the argument for this intervention, and what I found was healthcare has got better over the years from the end of the Second World War, and so healthcare has got better, and people are living longer, and as a result, death is becoming a taboo subject. And there's a prevalence of death anxiety as a result of people being, well, it's become hidden really in society, where people are in nursing homes as they get older, or hospitals, where it used to be the norm, where it was more aware, we were more aware of people dying in our communities. So this death anxiety started to arise, really, is happening. So I work in a hospice, and so I have a real interest in palliative care, and doing the Living Well to Die Well course, really, gosh, I thought, this is amazing. This is a fantastic opportunity for palliative care patients to actually experience using mindfulness and compassion to really cherish their lives. So palliative patients do have they experience a lot of physical and emotional side effects of their condition, and it's usually managed through medication, and they can be expensive, and also the side effects can be unpleasant. So really having an intervention that's non-pharmacological is actually really helpful to patients and the organisation as well, saving them money, and improving patient quality of life. So education is considered essential for individuals coming to the end of their life. And what I found in the research with the introduction, there was no education for palliative care patients. There was education for other sectors of society, but nothing for palliative care patients. And my argument really is, they're the people that are most in need of education at end of life. So by educating patients on the process of dying and the elements that come with it, in theory, I felt that this would reduce anxiety at the end of life. And then there would be the other side of that would be that patients would be reliant on medications, and they would be able to have conversations with family members about what they want. So mindfulness-based interventions are seen as they're effective and an alternative to medication. So that was the other thing I saw that's seen in the literature. And as I said, the Living Well to Die Well course is actually, that was my inspiration for this mindfulness-based intervention. Jane, could you move on, please? So I chose an integrative review as my choice for my research. Because of palliative care, going through ethics would be quite challenging. So a literature review, which is what I chose as my research, you could actually study this area without patients being directly involved. So, and ethics is quite challenging with this group of patients. So hence why I chose a literature review. So an integrative review, it combines theoretical and experiential scientific research. It combines the two, And I thought that was really interesting because you're bringing theory in and people's, and maybe some lines of thinking out the box really, and incorporating that into like a science, with the science, really, the two come together really well. And I felt that happened in the course of my research. The research question I used, I considered what would be important. So it was the key considerations of designing a mindfulness-based intervention for palliative care patients. The key considerations, what are important to palliative care patients when it comes to end-of-life anxiety, how to manage that. That was my ethos with my questioning. So I used the words mindfulness and meditation and death anxiety, fear of death and palliative care or hospice care. Now, the words were very important, and they are very important when it comes to defining your questions. Consideration needs to be given to those words. So when I put anxiety into the search, I got millions of results. So I brought it down to death anxiety. I narrowed it down to death anxiety as my key word. But also, interestingly enough, speaking to the librarian at Aberdeen University, she suggested you including hospice care. That would incorporate maybe studies from America and other places, because palliative care maybe isn't recognised as a phrase. So I followed her advice. I focused on adults as my group, because I work with adults. Studies had to be in English, and the exclusion criteria was children and carers, but there was no limitations placed on date of publication. I felt that was important because it was a new intervention that's yet to be introduced into the palliative care field. So I thought date of publication was just not an issue here. And I picked up, it was actually, 22 papers I included in when I narrowed my search down, and there was 4 key themes that were uncovered. Jane, can you go on to the next slide? Thank you. So basically the actual studies, there was interestingly enough, there was 81% of the research studies were research studies. So when I looked at the evidence, 81% of those were research studies that came up out of the 22 papers that I got. 1/3 was quantitative, and that's just quite surprising for me. It really didn't realise that, because it was a qualitative piece of work, because I was looking at people's experiences. But when I thought about it, it's actually really interesting, because it was good, because what the quantitative pieces of research did was bring a perspective of cause and effect of some of the interventions that were that I was considering. So these studies were really helpful in giving some evidence of effect. So I could consider that when introducing practices into the actual intervention, mindfulness practices. And there was only one study from the UK. And as I say, when I considered the problem with the UK is that we have, because of this ethics procedures, there's this mindset that patients who are palliative are too fragile to be able to take part in research. And there is evidence to suggest that patients want to have that legacy. They want to contribute to research. So it's quite interesting that there's a lot of red tape to be involved in the ethics side of things, but people have this mindset that patients are fragile and they don't want, they shouldn't be involved. And the other common theme was that the mindfulness research is building over the years. In the last 5 years, there was the most papers were produced in the last 5 years. So that was really interesting. So it's building over time. So palliative care is actually, they're looking at mindfulness and compassion. They're interested. People are interested. Word is getting out there. So what was interesting about the findings was that anxiety around death and dying, it will always persist. It will, it doesn't escape people. But what they're suggesting, the evidence is suggesting that if mindfulness and compassion can become tools to help with tolerance and building resilience, so they'll be able to cope when these feelings come through. There was only one formalised death education program, and it was in Korea, and it was quite it was interesting. It was for ladies with breast cancer, and there was things like climbing into coffins and things like that, and activities like that, which seemed quite extreme. So thinking about my course, I mean, looking at that, it was quite interesting. Some of the information and what they would include in the course was very interesting, and I used some of the ideas for that. Spirituality does what the one key thing that I found was with spirituality, there's a distinction between spirituality and religion, and you don't have to be religious to be a spiritual person, and that's something that's lacking in hospices. I feel that the hospice I work in, that is lacking, and that needs to come forward, and this course that want to put together, that will introduce that into the hospice. But what I found in the findings, spirituality is very important in the hospice. Patients find spirituality beneficial to the dying process, and so there's lots of connections with that. So finding meaning and purpose in life, legacy was a big thing. So what can you pass on to the next generation? Social connections was a big thing that came through the research, the research studies. Having a group of people that are even cherishing the people around, that was part of the spiritual process. And, it could potentially happen in a mindfulness-based intervention. Having that group of people with common ground coming together and sharing an experience. Yeah, so the other thing, it was like adjusting the mindset through this mindfulness practices and compassion. What was found that mindset was changed as a result of those practices, and it was things like breathing practices and loving kindness practices, imagery, that they were the key things that came through, and those practices helped to change people's mindsets, basically. So Jane, would you like to move on? So my conclusion, which is the exciting bit, is putting all the evidence together. And my idea was, and I had a key informant who works in palliative care as well, and she's a mindfulness teacher. She's put a course together herself, and we had discussions, and she felt it was really important to educate patients, as well as in symptom management, as well as using mindfulness to help with death anxiety. So I took on board her ideas, and the intervention that I wanted to take forward, it's a combination of the Living Well to Die Well course and the mindfulness-based living course. So the two of these courses put together. Because what I feel is, if you're coming into mindfulness and you've never done it before, coming into the Living Well to Die Well as straight into that course, it might actually be, you need to have some sort of background with mindfulness to be able to appreciate it. And one of the papers did identify that at week 4 of one of the mindfulness-based interventions, death anxiety became apparent. So my course, the one I've put together, they do the mindfulness-based living course from week 1 to 4, and then introduce practices of the Living Well to Die Well from week 4 onwards. But the course would have, the challenge was, do you introduce in education, you want somebody who has knowledge of different subject matter. So the common symptoms I wanted to focus on in educating patients was fatigue, breathlessness, pain and anxiety. So having somebody who's experienced in mindfulness, teaching mindfulness, but also has experience of teaching all those other aspects, is going to be quite challenging. So what I intend to do is to bring in teachers, so physios, occupational therapists, doctors to come in, social workers to come in and teach aspects of managing symptoms. So from the symptoms, there's breathlessness, pain, anxiety, and fatigue. You get particular health professionals would come in and maybe teach for 20 minutes on interventions that would help those patients in managing their condition, their symptoms. But then bringing other people in later on in the course for things like how to thinking about advanced directives. Do you want to be resuscitated near the end of your life? You know, what are the, you know, do you want, what about creating a will, or other things like funerals, planning a funeral? All those things are really important. So over the weeks of the course would be 8 weeks, but then we'd meet up monthly after that, and other practices from the Living Well to Die Well course would be brought in, and then they'd also have these other teaching elements. But the beauty of that is that the patients they'd be seen at an early stage, and that was the other thing I wanted to stipulate, that patients could be seen at an early stage of early in the journey, so that you could actually appreciate the course all the way through. But also you develop relationships with other course participants, and they would support each other through the course. So by the end of it, they'd got this group of friends that would be able to support them, but they'd also have this knowledge as well. So it was really important to bring them in right at the early stage of their condition. So what I'll do is leave it there if anybody would like to ask any questions.